Good morning, this is Angela with Parkrose Permaculture. The cool front has moved in and the rain has moved in as well, so we are no longer having 89-degree days. We're back down to more typical weather for early May. It is going to be in the 60s and raining for the next several days, so I'm pretty excited about that because that's optimal weather for yard work. So I made a video talking a little bit about polyculture, and in that video I mentioned that I wanted to talk about guilds. When people first get into permaculture, they're often quite they dive into the concept of guilds and wanting to make sure that they get it just right. So I wanted to talk about that. We are standing in my side yard. We're right next to my Amity red raspberries, which are just about to bloom. Part of the reason that we put raspberries here is I try and think about putting things where if they need to be tended to frequently by people, they are near the house. So when the raspberries are ripe, we're going to be out picking every single day. This is a sunny location close to the back door of the house. As we move on from here, some of my kids' squirt guns are out because it was very hot yesterday. They're out playing squirt guns. As we move back here, the corner of the house is right here. This is my breakfast nook. We have a quince tree here that I have pruned as a bush. This quince tree puts out 50 to 70 pounds of quince every year. It's ridiculous how much you get off one tree. As we move around here, I want to talk about this guild. So in permaculture, guilds are basically taking companion planting to the next level, leveling up your companion planting. Right here we have the door that's going to be the door for my greenhouse. I've just stored it there for now until I get the greenhouse built. So I'm going to back up here a little bit past this rose. Hello, chickens. Okay, so this is a guild. A guild is companion planting, intensely thought out, and is based usually around a fruit or nut tree. There are exceptions to that, but this is the center of this guild. It is an Ashmead's kernel apple tree. Every time I talk about Ashmead's kernel on my videos, somebody makes a comment, or if I talk about them on my Facebook page, people sort of either really, really love them or they think that they're overrated. I think Ashmead's kernel is one of the finest dessert apples, and I absolutely love it. It is a little fussy to grow. It's a little bit of a diva. So I do have exceptions in general. I grow fruit trees that are low work for me and high yield, and ones that are very hardy. The exception to that is a couple of apples that I'm extremely fond of and are more prone to some disease pressure, and also a little bit fussier in their pruning and sometimes yield in alternate years or have more complicated issues, and I'm willing to put up with that to get any crop that I can out of that. Also, I have one plum, Bavay's Green Gage plum. That is an exception as well because the quality of the fruit is so high. I'm willing to put up with the fussiness. Okay, so this apple tree here is, I'm trying to think, I think it's 9 years old. And when it was very young, a neighbor kid snapped it almost in half on accident. It was just a whip, and I actually duct taped it because I didn't have any more anything else to use on it. I didn't have any more grafting tape left. So I used duct tape, and it healed very nicely. There's an ugly scar, but the tree is doing fantastic. So when we think about guilds, we're thinking about growing them. So I'm having a little issue with my microphone here. We're thinking about growing a main tree and what we can grow around it to support it, where all the plants are mutually beneficial. So some of the early writing that Bill Mollison did on guilds and other people have done in guilds focuses on the concept of these different layers in permaculture. So you have the canopy layer, which here we actually don't really have a canopy because this is a semi-dwarf apple tree. So there actually isn't a canopy tree right here. Then you have the lower layer tree, sub-canopy tree, which would be this tree. And then below that you have shrub layer, which here serving that purpose would be this quince. I also have a lilac that serves that purpose. And then below that you have an herbaceous layer, which includes things like tall herbs like comfrey and fennel, and also this peony counts. And then below that you have a rhizomatous layer, right? Things that are growing underground, where you're thinking about either they're a dynamic accumulator or they're a root crop of some kind. So I have sunchokes in here. This actually I wouldn't technically consider part of the guild. I have a swath of sunchokes against the fence. And the reason that I have them there is because it's sunny. It's an area that I amended with a lot of sand. It's out of the way. Sunchokes can get floppy. And back there, they're in nobody's way. And I only deal with sunchokes twice a year to cut them down when they fall over in the fall, and then later in the fall and winter to harvest them. So they're a crop that doesn't need tending much, so they're tucked back in this corner. Okay, so after that rhizome layer, you are going to talk about a ground cover layer. This would include things like clover, mint can be a ground cover, strawberries, things like that. And then the last layer in guilds and in the concept of permaculture is actually the vertical layer, which would be vines, of which I have some. We'll get to them in a minute. So when people start out making guilds, they can get a little fixated on needing to have all 7 of these layers in order to be a legitimate guild. That's not true. You don't have to do that. You might not have a vine that works, or you might not want to have a vine growing up through your tree or a place to trellis it. You might not actually need very much in terms of the herbaceous layer. You might not need a living ground cover to some extent because you use thick mulch, okay? So just keep in mind, those are 7 ways and orientations of the growth of plants that you can utilize in your garden. I would also add one more, and that would be a fungal layer that for here in this area of the garden, I have not only the beneficial fungi that interact with the wood chips, but I also have morels that are seeded in here because they grow very well under apple trees. So there aren't any fruiting bodies right now, but when we have some, I'll make a video about it. So, okay. Let's not stress about guilds and needing to have all 7 layers. Let's do what works for us. I find that for me, if I am enjoying gardening and it feels like something that benefits my mental health and my physical health, and it's something that I derive pleasure from and centers me and calms me, I'm going to be in the garden a lot more. If I'm in the garden more, I'm going to be noticing problems and catching them early and nipping them in the bud, and I'm going to have more success overall. So it's a cyclical relationship, right? Mutually beneficial relationship. The more I enjoy the garden and the less it stresses me out, the more I'm out here. And the more I nip problems in the bud, the less there is to stress about. Okay. So if you're thinking about guilds, don't get stressed in trying to find the perfect companion plants. You can put things in. They don't work, you can take them out. Okay. Around this apple tree, I have this lilac, which I got as, it's gotten quite large and I like it because it obscures the corner of my shed. I will take it down a little bit this year. It is also part of a trellis here for my Valkenblau rose. So all of this here, these are plants that attract pollinators. Back in this corner, I'm going to move through here and not step on plants because there's a lot of things to step on here. As we come back here, here are my sunchokes, which as you can see have their own rectangular bed. And then back in this corner, I have a vine layer. So I have a rose, and then I have a evergreen clematis, which is going to cover the shed. It's pretty new. And this rose is also going to get bigger and taller. Part of this is because this is my neighbor's driveway, and then my other neighbors over here who are lovely people, I want something pretty for them to look at. And also we have a nice open face rose. That's great bee food. And you might wonder whether it gets enough sun back here. Yeah, this is very sunny. It gets tons of sun. Okay, so here's my apple tree. I'm gonna tuck back under here. Oh, see the apples here? Okay. Coming back here, excuse the mess. Coming back over here, I have peonies. A lot of my herbaceous things can also serve a ground cover function. They can cover quite a bit. I have a sterile Russian Bakken comfrey right here, which is a plant that is got many uses. Oh, so I'll say if you're thinking about guilds and companion planting, if you can have something that lives by the rule of 3, which is where you get at least 3 benefits out of it, throw that sucker in there over a companion plant that only has 1 job, okay? So comfrey is going to attract bees like crazy, also hummingbirds. It's a useful mulch plant, and I put it toward the base of all of my apple trees, all of my fruit trees, because in Oregon, in this part of Oregon, we have very thick, heavy soils. And as everybody knows, comfrey has a very deep taproot that breaks up the soil and improves drainage. So I put it near the root of the trees. Okay. This plant will get cut several times during the season. It will flower many times because of it, and it will be used as mulch. So here, again, it's still early May, so a lot of my herbaceous companion plants are just coming up. We used to have a fairy garden here, and the kids and I took it apart, so I've just seeded new things under here. We've moved our fairy garden elements elsewhere. It wasn't working for us here, and part of the fairy garden has been taken apart and made into a toad home. So this will fill in, but I do use a lot of wood chips for mulch. So I'm doing okay not having a living mulch at this point in time. Okay. I have native Oregon iris here. And then I have in this area of the garden, I have chocolate mint. I grow a lot of mints. One of my kids collects them, and I think they make a great ground cover. People are afraid to put them in the ground, but when you put them in a pot, they tend to get rust. And my rule is in the spring, I rip up half the mint patch. When it's a nice, moist day, it's been rainy, the soil's really moist, the rhizomes come up very easily, and it's very easy to take up half your mint and get rid of it. Don't put it in your home compost. If you cold compost, that would be a disaster. You'd have mint everywhere. I put it in the yard waste, which is hot compost. So mint, which will flower and attract lots of bees. So in here, I also have a rhubarb. This is another plant that you can consider the rhizomatous layer, and also produces food. It has a very big root, breaks up the soil. Also, one thing I love about rhubarb is that the leaves funnel water down into their roots. So if you are growing rhubarb near your fruit trees, they catch that rainwater and funnel it down. So this will be full. This has baby rudbeckias and cranesbill geraniums and other things like that are all going to fill in here as ground cover. Elsewhere in the garden, I tend to use a lot of native strawberries for ground cover. They work really well. I just don't want to have them in every single part of my garden, so they're not here. My hope is that here the geraniums will fill in. And again, things like the rudbeckia will be a late summer flower. I have lavender here. So I'm going to back up this way a little bit. So when we're thinking about guilds, again, I talked about those, the notion of having these different layers. So that's one way you can view the concept of a guild, is the layers in which these plants grow. I forgot there's a hollyhock here. Another way you can think about guilds is in terms of companion planting. Like I said, everything you want to have it have at least 3 purposes if possible. So you're thinking about putting in plants that fill various roles. Things to think about in terms of the role they're filling are, again, a mulch plant, something you can chop and drop for mulch. Leaves from rhubarb work very well for this. Comfrey works very well for this. Things that can get repeatedly cut down and thrown down to contribute biomass are great. Things that are dynamic accumulators or have large roots that bust up soil, you want to think about adding those. You want to think about plants that bring in the insects, beneficial insects. Fennel brings in beneficial parasites. Anything with an umbel-shaped flower is going to bring in those beneficial wasps, and they're going to bring in very small native bees. Lavender, anything that's kind of stinky, basil, lavender. I grow a lot of, I'm sorry, looking at birdies. Hello, birdie. I grow a lot of strong smelling herbs. Elsewhere in the garden I have rue. Those are going to deter pests that you don't want. I think that's a little bit overblown in permaculture sometimes about having confusers. So be it. Other things you want to think about when you're thinking about that, having ground cover, either the soil needs to be covered so that it doesn't bake, right? And you're supporting your microbial life. So either wood chips or a living ground cover. Even better if you can get a ground cover that fixes nitrogen, like clover. A lot of places in my garden I have, listening to the birdies, sorry. You can have a ground cover that fixes nitrogen, cool. If you can have a shrub layer that fixes nitrogen, like a gummy berry, that's also great. Or a Siberian pea shrub, something like that. So I just noticed that there's some volunteer potatoes back here. My kids, and we use trench composting, so in the winter we tend to bury kitchen scraps that the chickens won't eat in places, and sometimes that means I get volunteer potatoes and onions and volunteer garlic. So thinking about those roles when you're having companion plants is really great, but you also need to think about how compatible the plants are in general. So I want to put two things together that grow well together. I want to put things that, these are two really critical, let's go with three really critical things. I can't wait till this peony blooms, y'all. It's really close to blooming. You can see the ants on it, which help it open up. So I want to think about compatible pH. We're not going to grow blueberries, which like a soil pH of 4.5 to 5.5, and put them in and have their companion plant annual be a broccoli, which likes a really sweet soil. Okay. That's not going to work. That's not setting us up for success. You can definitely underplant with annuals. In this bed, I usually do pumpkins because it's often been a children's garden. I have not this year because I added all these baby perennials. I didn't want to add pumpkins and have them get shaded out. But you can absolutely add annuals. Just think about the pH. You also need to think about water needs. You don't want to mix something that needs a lot of water with something that's extremely drought tolerant. I'm going to do another video later on one of the guilds in the front yard in a very sunny aspect where everything is drought tolerant and I don't water anything. So thinking about that, you don't want to overwater something that has a low need for water because you are trying to give sufficient water to something else planted right next to it. The third thing to think about, okay, so we talked about pH, water needs. The third thing to think about is how much sun something needs. So you need to think about your primary fruit or nut tree and how when it gets big, it will eventually shade things. And can the plants you're underplanting with that tree tolerate that amount of sunlight per day? Part of the reason that this lavender, which looks really rough because my dogs trample it every time they come by and they've broken a lot of branches. So yeah, this is down here in the front because the sun is coming in this way, right there. So I'm not going to plant my lavender back here where it's going to get shaded by my apple tree. So I hope that gives you some things to think about with guilds. I'm going to do a video or several videos probably on some of my other guilds. Sorry for we've been working in the yard. I have alpaca fleece drying. This is my yard waste bin. I've been cutting back things, like I said, mint and things that I can't otherwise use. We got a young chicken, so she arrived in that. So this is what a working family garden looks like. It doesn't always look perfect, and there's often mess. So I'm going to be talking about, I want to talk about my persimmon guild and some other gilding that I have around the yard, but I want to encourage you all to just not stress about it. Do what works for you. And feel free to experiment, thinking about those basic principles of the layers that you plant in, what the jobs are you want your plants to do, and compatibility, and then just throw things in and experiment. And honestly, like if your budget doesn't allow for it and all you get in is that apple tree and some mulch initially, cool. Add the other plants as time goes on. Because in permaculture, we make slow, small changes, right? So if you are not able to afford to plant out a perfect guild every time you put in a tree, that's okay. Right, well, I hope that had some value for you all and answered some questions. I'll be back tomorrow with another video. Please like this video if you enjoyed it and got something out of it. And please subscribe to my channel so that I can continue making more videos almost every single day. I'm gonna hope to be out here almost every day in the summer. All right, thanks.